My girlfriend of 3 years aimed a Mech's main cannon at me, all to get a spot inside the human bastion. She pointed at my right arm, which had mutated while saving her, and screamed hysterically. She told the enforcement team that I was an infected mutant monster. She begged the Mech to put me down immediately under the extermination protocol. I looked into her cold, calculating eyes and felt nothing but disgust. But what she didn't know was that the very next second, the ground split open with a thunderous crash. A pure white tiger, more than 100 meters long, burst out of the earth. With one swipe, it crushed that Vanguard-class Mech. Under everyone's horrified gaze, that invincible king of beasts actually lowered its head. In a deep, choked voice, it called me son. That was when I realized this so-called mutation wasn't an infection at all. It was the divine sequence, one that breaks the limits of carbon-based life. And it all started with the escape half a month earlier. A few days earlier, the sky looked like it was covered by a thick layer of frosted glass. Strange blue spores drifted through the air. This was ruined City 47. What had once been a thriving human home was now nothing but shattered ruins. My girlfriend, Lin Wan, huddled beneath a collapsed load-bearing wall. Her pale face was covered in dust, and she was trembling all over. She had once been the proud beauty of our college department, but half a month on the run had completely broken her. Crying, she asked me if we were going to die here. I swallowed against my dry throat and gave her the last mouthful of water. I told her, "Don't be scared. If we can find the Bastion's patrol route, we'll make it out alive." If I hadn't risked my life to protect her again and again, she would have become food for the mutant beasts of the wasteland long ago. Just then, a massive engine roar came from overhead. A blue searchlight tore through the haze. It was the symbol of humanity's greatest military power. A squad of psionic mechs swept over the distant ruins. Lin Wan's face instantly lit up with wild joy. She was about to call out for help, but I clamped a hand tightly over her mouth and pinned her back into the shadows. Then came a teeth-grating clatter. A blade-armored boar beast, the size of a sedan, crawled down. Its compound eyes glowed with a cold red light. Its forelimbs, sharp as war blades, crept closer to us little by little. The roar of the mechs faded into the distance, and death came instead. Without the slightest hesitation, the blade-armored boar beast struck at Lin Wan. I let out a low growl and shoved him away. I grabbed the rebar I'd gotten ready and thrust it at its compound eye. The huge impact instantly split open the web between my thumb and forefinger. Not only did the rebar fail to pierce its shell, it was actually bent out of shape instead. The boar beast's other forelimb slammed right into my chest. I was sent flying, crashing through part of a low wall. The intense pain nearly made me pass out right there. Just as the monster closed in again, my heart started pounding wildly. A scorching surge suddenly burst from deep inside my heart, racing through my veins into my right arm. My right arm felt like it was about to burst into flames. A layer of dark golden scales actually spread across my skin. A mechanical notification flashed through my mind. Unique talent origin sequence is awakening. Localized behemoth transformation complete. I had no time to think about what was happening. The boar beast's deadly blade was already slashing down at my head. On instinct, I raised that scale-covered arm and grabbed at it. An astonishing scene played out in the ruins. That forelimb, sharp enough to cut through an armored vehicle, was actually locked in my grip. With a burst of overwhelming brute force, the monster's hard, chitinous exoskeleton shattered piece by piece. I followed up with a heavy punch straight to its abdomen. The massive boar beast was sent flying by that inhuman force and crashed hard outside the ruins. After a few struggles, it went completely still. The danger was over. I took deep breaths, trying to steady my heartbeat. The dark golden scales on my right arm slowly faded away, and it returned to normal. I turned around, wanting to give Lin Wan a relieved smile after surviving all that. But instead, I saw her pressed tightly into the corner, trembling. There was no relief in her eyes when she looked at me, only stabbing terror and deep disgust. Her lips trembled as she whispered the word, "Monster." That word hit my heart like an icy hammer. I had just started to explain when a strong wave of dizziness hit me. Awakening a power beyond my rank had drained my strength in an instant. I slumped weakly against the pile of rubble. My vision went dark. In that suffocating silence, 3 blinding beams of light suddenly descended from the sky. 315-meter Vanguard-class escort mechs landed. The Vanguard-class escort mechs landed. Faint blue patterns flowed across their cold steel armor. Their searchlights instantly lit up the ruins like day. A synthetic voice came from the mech's speaker, announcing that a life signal had been detected. The fear in Lin Wan's eyes was instantly replaced by wild joy. She scrambled to her feet and staggered toward the light, shouting that she was a survivor and begging them to save her. I was half kneeling in the shadows, watching her run toward the light. I reached out my right hand, but grabbed only cold air. The towering mech looked down at Lin Wan on the ground. A green scanning beam swept over her entire body. No signs of alien spore infection detected. Permission to board granted. A hatch in the mech's abdomen opened, and a lift lowered. Lin Wan's eyes filled with tears of excitement. She stepped onto it with one foot. But then the pilot suddenly asked, "There is another signal deeper in the ruins. Is that your companion? Are they in a safe condition?" Lin Wan's body suddenly went rigid. The human bastion has an absolutely brutal law of evolution. Anyone who mutates after coming into contact with spores must be eliminated. Anyone connected to a mutant is also exiled to the wasteland. She turned to look at me, hidden in the shadows and unable to stand. I looked at her with eyes full of hope, hoping she would save me. As long as she said, I came with her, the mech could take me back to the medical bay. Maybe I could still survive in this brutal wasteland. But in the face of the overwhelming urge to survive, all feelings fell apart in an instant. She took a deep breath. Her eyes turned cold and calculating. Facing the communicator, she said clearly, I'm not her companion. She even said without hesitation that I'd grown monstrous scales, that I was already infected, and requested immediate purification for safety, so she could enter the safe zone with a clean record. She ruthlessly cut off my last chance at survival. In the shadows, my pupils suddenly shrank. I stared hard at this woman. There was no furious roar, and no despair at all. So when it comes to the wasteland, human feelings can be this cheap. The mech pilot got the intel, and immediately identified the infection source. The mech in the center menacingly raised its massive right arm. The dark muzzle of the high-frequency particle cannon was aimed right at me. An eerie blue energy gathered wildly. With a chilling hum, the shadow of death closed over me in an instant. Lin Wan turned away and stopped looking at me. She rose straight into the sky. To her, I was already just a piece of trash that had died in the past. I slowly closed my eyes. A fury I'd never felt before ignited in my chest. If this is humanity's law, then I want no part of it. The particle cannon's charge reached its peak. The blue light in its 4 ports was about to erupt. At that critical moment, the earth suddenly let out a mournful cry. Across the ruins for several kilometers, the ground began to shake violently. Countless massive rocks were lifted into the air by an invisible force. A terrifying pressure, so intense it made the air feel thick, shot into the sky. Inside the mech, the alarm started blaring shrilly. It reported a transcendent-level reaction with immeasurable energy. The next second, before Lin Wan and the pilot's horrified eyes, a gigantic tiger claw, as huge as a mountain and white as carved jade, burst out of the earth. A golden aura that could cut through anything swirled around the giant claw. As if swatting a fly, it slammed straight into the mech's energy shield. The shield, said to withstand a full-force strike from a high-level star beast, shattered instantly. Then, a domineering tiger roar that shook the sky rang across the ruins. Who dares lay a hand on my son? Along with the violent tiger roar, the ruined ground collapsed with a thunderous crash. A pure white giant beast over 100 meters long burst out from below. Its entire body was covered in pure white fur like polar ice and snow. Every strand of fur shimmered with a chilling sharpness. Before this 100-meter behemoth, the mech's humanity took pride in, looked like nothing more than plastic toys. Inside the mech cockpit, crimson warning lights flashed wildly. Lin Wan, sitting in the co-pilot seat, was already shaking so badly her legs had gone weak. She collapsed into her seat, her mind completely blank, her whole body trembling. The white tiger's beast eyes, blazing like golden suns, swept coldly over the mech. With just a glance, it made the psychic core let out an overloaded wail. It raised its right paw. It didn't use any skill, relying on nothing but sheer mass. It brought it down on the mech locked onto me, along with that high-frequency particle cannon. With one swipe, the white tiger smashed them into flying scrap metal. The massive impact sent the hundreds of tons mech flying. It crashed through more than a dozen buildings in a row, before finally losing all power. The 2 remaining mechs were scared out of their wits. They didn't even dare think about fighting back. They immediately pushed their engines to the limit, turning into streaks of light, and fled madly toward the human bastion, amid the dust filling the sky. The 2 fleeing mechs looked like stray dogs. The white tiger didn't chase them. Instead, it stopped its mountain-like body. That wild pressure that could shake heaven and earth vanished in an instant. Under my stunned gaze, it carefully lowered its head. Even that huge movement carried a caution, as if afraid of startling me. Its tiger head, bigger than a heavy truck, moved close to me. Its golden eyes were filled with an almost human tenderness. A warm breath gently brushed across my dust-covered cheek. Then a deep, choked, middle-aged man's voice sounded in my mind. Xiaoyuan, Dad came too late. You've suffered all these years. I froze in place. Even after 10 years had passed, even though he had now turned into a terrifying beast, I still recognized that voice instantly. A trembling sound squeezed out of my dry throat. In these 10 years of clawing my way across the wasteland, I hadn't shed a tear, but in that moment my eyes instantly reddened. The tension in my nerves finally gave way. Everything went black before my eyes. And under the white tiger's gentle spiritual power, I fell into a deep sleep. I don't know how much time passed before I opened my eyes again and found myself lying in a huge cavern brimming with life. The spiritual energy filling the air made my damaged meridians tingle. A hearty laugh rang out. I bolted upright. I saw a burly man with knotted muscles, solid as granite, carrying a stone pot radiating waves of energy, striding toward me. His wild white hair and the pale golden tiger mark totem on his chest marked him as my father, Lu Zhantian, who had vanished 10 years ago while searching for a cure. He rubbed my hair. With a deep look in his eyes, he told me to eat first. As the stew settled in my stomach, a huge wave of heat began healing my internal injuries. My father also revealed the shocking truth about the world from the past 10 years. The spores were never a deadly virus meant to wipe out humanity. They were a catalyst accepted by Earth's will to embrace evolution and resist higher dimensional attacks, to keep their monopoly on ruling class status. The conglomerates and the top brass of the human bastions hid the truth. They imposed ironclad rules centered on cold mechs powered by external force, and branded anyone who reached the threshold of evolution as monsters. My father refused to buy that. He went deep into the meteor crater and fused with the first-generation spores. Now the entire 100,000 mountains reveres him as the Zheng Metal Tiger King. By the time I heard all this, my whole worldview had been completely turned upside down. I lowered my head and looked at my right hand. Then, remembering the disgust in Lin Wan's eyes, I asked my father, "The scales growing on me, is that evolution too?" My father grabbed my arm at once. After examining it carefully, he was overjoyed. He patted my shoulder excitedly and said, "There were no chaotic genes in my body. What I had awakened was the most perfect origin sequence in Earth's evolutionary archive. When others evolve, they turn into monsters. But I was breaking the limits of carbon-based life to become a god standing at the top of life's pyramid." My father burst out laughing and took out a king-tier crystal core glowing with molten gold light. He said he would purify the king's blood and use this marrow fluid to remake me. The golden liquid, thick as mercury, instantly wrapped around me. The violent energy savagely tore through my cells. I gritted my teeth. Without letting out a single scream, Lin Wan's cold, unfeeling figure kept replaying in my mind. To hell with that high and mighty tide of steel. Today, I'll forge invincible power with my flesh and blood body. The pain faded, replaced by a sense of total control. I snapped my eyes open. My right arm changed in an instant. Perfect dark gold scales covered the muscle. Terrifying claws sharp enough to cut through iron extended from my fingertips. This was no longer the twisted mutation of those monsters, but a titan arm full of brutal beauty. With a casual clench of my fist, the air let out a terrifying boom. My father looked at me with satisfaction as I was reborn. He pointed at the distant canyon and said with a wild grin, an elite scavenger convoy had just arrived there. He wanted me to tear those scrap mechs apart with my bare hands. Meanwhile, in the lower residential sector of the Kanxiong Bastion, the air was thick with the sharp smell of motor oil and cheap perfume. Lin Wan was humbly trying to curry favor with a maintenance technician. She thought reporting me would earn her better housing rights. But reality had slapped her hard in the face. She had no one backing her, so she could only rely on this man and spend every day watching people's expressions, living a life worse than a pig or a dog. She looked at the thick energy shield outside the window and kept telling herself that at least she was still alive and safe. She was sure I was already gone, with not even a trace of bone left. But at that moment, on the endless wasteland beyond the shield, I was sprinting bare-chested like a cheetah. The gale was like a blade, yet it couldn't leave even a white mark on my skin. My eyes burned with fierce fighting spirit. Just then, the radar detected a high-energy life-form signal. The scavenger convoy stopped on high ground 2 kilometers away from me. The captain let out a contemptuous sneer and said, I was just a low-level infected, then sent 2 light mechs to take me out. The engines of the 25-meter-tall mechs roared furiously as they raised high-frequency chainsaw swords that could cut through steel plates and came straight for my head with a piercing whine. Not only did I not slow down, I pushed off the ground even harder instead and charged straight at them like a cannonball. Just as the blade came within less than half a meter of my head, My titan arm, covered in dark golden scales, rose up. A deafening clang of metal echoed across the wasteland. Sparks exploded through the air like a waterfall. Before the pilot's horrified eyes, the supposedly unstoppable chainsaw sword was blocked by my bare hand. Then, I tightened my right hand and crushed the special alloy. Then my left arm clamped onto the mech's leg like an iron vice. A terrifying force beyond human limits erupted. I swung the 10-ton mech into the air with one hand. The cockpit instantly filled with flashing red warning lights. I didn't pause for even a moment. Like swinging a giant iron hammer, I smashed the mech hard into the other one that was getting ready to fire. The two steel giants slammed hard into each other in midair. There were no energy beams, just the most basic kind of physical collision. The two mechs were instantly twisted into mangled heaps of scrap metal. They crashed hard onto the wasteland, leaving a massive crater. Everyone in the convoy stared at me like I was some kind of monster. The captain was scared out of his mind and yelled frantically, "Charge the main cannon." Light began gathering in the psionic main cannon in the heavy mech's chest, but my neural reaction speed was now on par with a star beast. I turned into a dark gold blur, leaving a sonic boom cloud behind me. The main cannon's beam grazed my afterimage and shaved off half a hill. By then, I was already right in front of the mech. I drove a brutal punch into the half-meter-thick composite armor. The armor was punched clean through as if it were made of paper. I grabbed the trembling captain by the collar and ripped him out like yanking up a carrot. I told him to go back and tell the higher-ups in the human bastion that this wasteland answers to me now. I tore out the high-tier psionic core and disappeared into the wind and sand. Father looked at the core and said, "The energy is nowhere near enough. To complete full titanization, we need king-tier origin essence, and the most perfect crystal core was stolen by the humans long ago and turned into the power core of the mobile fortress Skyvault." Father told me to flip that fortress over from its base. I gazed at the steel beast at the far end of the sandstorm. That was the paradise Lin Wan would do anything to get into. I clenched my right fist, and the crack of my bones rang clearly through the wind. Humanity's rules and Lin Wan's fake pride would soon be completely crushed under my feet. After that, I slipped into the fortress's lower district wearing a cloak, perfectly concealing the energy fluctuations of the origin sequence. To those crude detectors, I was just a drifter. The lower district was full of smugglers and laborers at the very bottom. Lin Wan was arm in arm with that mechanic, picking out purified water. The instant she turned her head, she suddenly froze. Even with my hood pulled low, there was no way she could mistake me. Her face went deathly pale. She couldn't believe I was still alive. That terrifying thought instantly swallowed her up. If I exposed how she murdered her boyfriend, she would be thrown off the fortress at once to feed the mutant beasts. After the fear came even more extreme selfishness and malice. He grabbed the mechanic's arm tight and forced out a few tears, pointing at me as he shouted, "That is a high-risk infected in disguise." The mechanic's face changed instantly, and he immediately hit the emergency comms. "Call the lower city security squad. Request immediate on-site purification." The piercing alarm instantly ripped through the black market's noise. 28-meter-tall shockwave mechs charged into the street. Their cold, high-voltage electromagnetic guns locked straight onto my head. A cold, merciless warning came over the loudspeaker. I slowly set down the scrap machine parts in my hands. There was no panic and no anger either. I just calmly turned to look at Lin Wan behind the crowd. My gaze was too calm, like I was looking at an ant. That indifference deeply wounded her fragile pride. He screamed like crazy, telling them to open fire and kill me. The shockwave mech's electromagnetic guns finished charging in an instant. Ghostly blue high-voltage arcs shot out like venomous snakes. I didn't activate the Titan's arm, or even throw off my cloak. I simply slowly raised my left hand and gave a light flick in the air. A terrifying shockwave, visible to the naked eye, exploded outward. The high-voltage arcs slammed into the absolute vacuum barrier and fell apart. They couldn't even stir the hem of my clothes. The mech enforcement officers were dumbfounded, unable to believe it. I took a step forward. The alloy ground beneath my feet cracked, spreading terrifying spiderweb like cracks for more than 10 meters. The pressure of a predator at the top of the food chain made the mechs wail. I said, "Humans always like to use scrap metal to hide their weakness." I lifted my head. My hood slipped back, revealing a cold, sharp face. Dark gold scales on my right arm showed faintly beneath my sleeve. "Since you think I'm an unforgivable monster, then I'll show you what a real calamity looks like." Just then, the highest blood red alert lit up over the inner city. The silver-grade mech knights were cleared to deploy in full battle gear. That was the inner city's most elite silver-grade mech knights. Every single one was equipped with the latest psionic light sword. They were big shots you normally wouldn't even see in the lower city. Yet now, they acted like they were facing a deadly enemy. as they poured out of the inner city passage. A full 10 silver-white killing machines surrounded me completely. The captain at their head issued a cold warning in a lofty tone, ordering me to kneel immediately and hand over the mutated crystal core inside my body. Lin Wan saw all this from a distance and trembled with excitement. She grabbed Mechanic Zhao's hand tightly and shouted like crazy that I was definitely done for this time and would be wiped out completely. But what she didn't know was, as I looked at these arrogant mechs, all I felt was uncontrollable excitement and bloodlust. The origin sequence inside me was roaring wildly, eager to tear those fake steel toys apart. I didn't waste any words. My right arm instantly transformed into a giant beast limb. Under the harsh light, the dark gold scales reflected a deadly gleam. Seeing this, the Knight Commander let out a furious roar and ordered everyone to kill me. 10 azure psionic blades slashed at me at once. In an instant, heat intense enough to vaporize an entire street burst out. But against the origin sequence's absolute physical power, this so-called high-tech stuff was a complete joke. I drove my legs down hard and shattered the alloy ground within 100 meters. I appeared in front of one mech as if I had teleported. Ignoring the psionic blade that could split a mountain, my dark gold claw pierced straight through the mech's chest. In one motion, I ripped out the blue glowing psionic core inside. With its power gone, the silver mech collapsed with a crash like a pile of scrap metal. The Knight Commander and all his men were completely dumbfounded. The armor they were so proud of was like paper in front of me. I gave them no time to recover from their terror. I became an ancient beast, slaughtering its way through a flock of sheep. With one punch, I crushed a mech's head flat. With one kick, I snapped another mech's support leg. In less than half a minute, the once arrogant Knight Order had been reduced to scrap metal all over the ground. Terrified, the Knight Commander yanked the controls like mad, trying to escape back to the inner city. But I dropped from the sky and crushed the cockpit with one stomp. I looked down at Lin Wan in the distance, now completely limp. The hope that had just lit up in her eyes was instantly swallowed by an endless abyss. That mechanic brother Zhao, who usually threw his weight around, finally came to his senses too. He viciously slapped Lin Wan across her pale face. He cursed her for provoking a monster that even the inner city couldn't fight. Lin Wan collapsed hopelessly in the oil-soaked ruins. She looked at me with the kind of fear one feels before a true god. But I had no interest left in the regret of vermin like them. I looked up at the incredibly thick inner city energy shield. Right, beneath that luxurious inner city, I could clearly feel a massive heart beating. It was the power core of the entire mobile bastion, Sky Vault. In other words, it was the ancient King-class Star Beast crystal core Dad sent me to retrieve. I took a deep breath. The dark gold scales on my right arm shone even brighter. All my power gathered in my Titan arm. Facing that energy shield said to be completely impregnable, I threw a vicious punch powerful enough to tear the sky apart, with a terrifying boom that nearly shattered everyone's eardrums. The energy shield that had protected humanity's upper class for decades suddenly cracked all over under my fist. The entire Skyvault bastion began to shake violently. The Supreme Commander at the top of the bastion stared at the screen, cold to the bone. They couldn't understand how a discarded lumen could unleash power on par with a King-class Star Beast. With a sharp crack, the shield shattered completely. I stepped over the mech wreckage scattered across the ground and made my way into the inner city step by step. Those tycoons and nobles who usually stood above everyone else were now running and screaming like refugees from the lower city. I ignored them and headed straight for the power core. The door to the power core was made of hundreds of tons of superalloy, but in front of my Titan arm, it was as fragile as paper. I drove both hands into the crack in the door. With a terrifying roar, I ripped apart the bastion's strongest door with my bare hands. Behind it was an enormous abyssal furnace chamber. A dark red crystal core, the size of a small mountain, floated in midair. That was Skyvault's energy source, a King-class heart. Just getting close to it, I could feel its destructive aura. The cells in my body trembled wildly, like parched earth finally getting rain. Without a second thought, I leaped into the air. With one punch, I shattered the extraction device. Then I pressed my right hand directly against that massive heart. In an instant, the devouring instinct of the origin sequence was fully awakened. The King-class Star Beast's incomparably pure source energy burst out like a broken dam and surged wildly through my right arm into every part of my body. This tearing pain was 100 times worse than my first awakening. But I only gritted my teeth and endured this inhuman torment. I wanted the purest power in all creation to remake the body of a god. As I devoured it, the lights throughout the bastion began to flicker violently. The once deep blue energy shield instantly went dark after losing power. Without the shield's protection, the Skyvault was left completely exposed in the wasteland. From the distant wasteland came countless mutated beasts. Greedy roars. The lower district was instantly thrown into chaos, more desperate than hell itself. Seeing the lights around her go out and the beast horde flooding in, Lin Wan let out the most piercing, despair-filled scream of her life. She finally understood that the steel fortress she had turned to for survival, in the face of true power, wasn't even enough to serve as a decent grave. Meanwhile, inside the power chamber, I had already reached a critical transformation. Dark gold scales began spreading from my right arm across my entire body. My bones were reorganizing. My muscles cracked like steel. My once human form was rapidly evolving into an ancient titan. Just as my body was about to complete its full beast transformation, the dome of the power chamber was suddenly ripped open by a terrifying force. A 30-meter-tall, entirely dark gold ultimate mech descended. This was the Destroyer-class Judgment Mech, reserved exclusively for the Skyvault City Lord. Seated inside the cockpit, the City Lord roared in a voice full of terror and hatred. He said a lowly drifter, like me, had actually dared to destroy the foundation of the bastion. He activated the Starbreaker cannon in the mech's chest, said to be powerful enough to pierce the planet's core. A blinding red light lit up the entire power chamber like doomsday. But at that moment, I slowly opened my eyes, shining with golden light. The dark gold titan scales covering my body burst out with godlike pressure. I casually crushed the drained remains of the Royal Star Core in my hand. Facing that Starbreaker cannon, powerful enough to flatten mountain ranges, I let out a cold smile. I didn't dodge. Instead, I shot straight up toward the cannon's muzzle. Since you want to play, then I'll shatter your dream of being City Lord along with you. The dark gold scales all over my body burst out with godlike pressure. So what if it is a 30-meter-tall ultimate judgment mech? Today, I'm going to crush you, high and mighty City Lord, along with your hypocritical rule. Violent energy instantly swallowed me whole. Inside the cockpit, the City Lord burst into wild laughter. He shouted, "No one can survive a direct hit from the Starbreaker cannon. Even if you're a monster that devoured the Royal Star Core, you'll still die before this absolute technological force." But his laughter stopped abruptly the next second, because at the center of that blazing red energy storm, a dark gold giant hand that blotted out the sky reached out. That hand seemed to break through the absolute restraints of space itself, and clamped tightly around the searing barrel of the Starbreaker cannon. How is that possible? There is no way that is possible. The City Lord let out a horrific, blood-curdling scream. The mech's entire alarm system failed instantly. My massive body, like an ancient demon god, stepped out of the flames. My human form had already completely transformed. I had grown into the terrifying form of a 10-meter giant. My entire body was covered in flawless dark gold armor. Every scale carried a black hole-like sheen. Origin sequence, Phase 2. Titan Overlord body was fully achieved. With just a little force, that supposedly indestructible cannon barrel was like a plastic straw. As I crushed it straight into scrap metal, blinding sparks burst wildly across the mech's chest. Terrified, the City Lord frantically yanked the escape system's control lever, but I gave him no chance to hang on to life. The dark gold beast, trailing a sonic boom that seemed to tear through space, smashed hard into the Judgment Mech's chest armor, with a harsh metallic screech that set teeth on edge. This mech, the symbol of the human bastion's greatest military power, had its entire chest blasted through by my single punch. I grabbed the City Lord hiding inside the core cockpit, and yanked him out of the wreckage like a chick. His elegant uniform was smeared with oil and blood. Now he was struggling wildly in my hand, like a dog with a broken back. Crying and sobbing, he begged me to spare his miserable life. He said he was willing to hand over the entire Skyvault bastion to me. He was willing to give me all the wealth and women in the bastion. I looked at that disgusting face, twisted by power, and felt nothing but endless indifference and cold scorn. I told him before, "You parasites who steal energy must pay today for the crimes you've committed over the past 10 years. I suddenly tightened my grip. Amid a pig-like scream, this supreme tyrant who had ruled Skyvault for 10 years was crushed on the spot into a cloud of blood like a tomato in my hand. Along with him, his ridiculous dream of ruling vanished completely. With the City Lord's fall and the shield gone completely, the entire mobile bastion was plunged into utter despair. In the distant wasteland, terrifying yellow sand billowed into the sky. Tens of thousands of mutated beasts caught the scent of flesh and blood and surged into the lower city like a black tide. The once lofty steel walls became meaningless. The slum dwellers and smugglers cried out in despair. Meanwhile, Lin Wan was sprawled beside a sewer entrance. She was covered in muddy water and the foul-smelling blood of monsters. That mechanic, Brother Zhao, who said he'd protect her, pushed her out the moment the first wave of beasts rushed in. He grabbed a hover bike for himself and ran for his life alone. Lin Wan watched several pig beasts with glowing red eyes close in. She was so terrified that she scrambled backward on all fours, leaving foul-smelling wet streaks on the ground. She clawed at her hair like crazy, almost completely losing her mind. Why did this happen? She had clearly made it into the safe zone. She had clearly stepped over my corpse to trade for peace and safety. But, in less than half a day, heaven had turned into hell. Just as one pig beast raised its foreleg to hack her to death, the sky suddenly went dark. It was as if a mountain was pressing down overhead. My 10-meter-tall titan body leaped down from the ruins. With a thunderous crash, I crushed those pig beasts into pulp underfoot. The powerful shockwave wiped out the surrounding monsters. Lin Wan stared at me blankly. That dark gold figure looked like a god. That familiar outline made her recognize me instantly. Lu Yuan, is that you? You came to save me, didn't you? Like she was grabbing at a lifeline, she lunged at me like crazy. She even shamelessly wrapped herself around my calf. Then, she burst into loud sobs. She said she was wrong. Back then, the rules had left her no choice. She said she had always loved me. She begged me to take her away. As long as I could forgive her, she would willingly do anything. I lowered my head and looked down at her coldly, like she was trash. What the origin sequence gave me was not just power, but divinity as well. For a vile soul like hers, willing to sell out everything just to stay alive. I couldn't even work up the interest to kill her myself anymore. I slowly lifted my leg and kicked her away like a stinking rock. I said, "Aren't you so fond of humanity's law of survival? Then enjoy yourself out here in this wasteland." She didn't realize she was wrong. She just realized she was about to die. Ignoring her desperate, broken screams, I turned and strode toward the wasteland beyond the human bastion. Behind me came the horrific sounds of countless mutated beasts swarming her and tearing into her. From that moment on, that woman wasn't even dust in my life anymore. The instant I stepped out of the wreckage of the sky vault, the whole earth trembled with a violent jolt. A shockwave stretching dozens of kilometers appeared on the horizon. My old man, transformed into a 100-meter giant tiger, came charging in with an army, along with over 10,000 terrifying beasts, each one at least a high-tier star beast. But when they saw my 10-meter-tall dark gold titan form, every one of them dropped to the ground, trembling from the depths of their souls. This was the instinctive submission of lesser life forms before the divine sequence. My old man's massive white fox form stopped in front of me. His sun-bright vertical pupils were full of fervent pride. He spoke to me through spiritual transmission, so excited that even his voice was shaking. "Good kid. I knew you could tear a hole in the heavens. Not only did you drain the Royal Extreme Galaxy dry, you even completed your Titan transformation. Now even those old monsters hiding in Central Eden City would have to behave and take a beating if they ran into you." I reined in the violent energy around me and returned to human size. Though I looked normal on the outside, I could still feel the destructive power within me. I looked at my old man and asked, "What exactly is Central Eden City?" My old man put away his wild smile, and his expression turned graver than ever before. He said, "Skyvault was nothing more than a dumping ground the conglomerates abandoned. The real upper echelon, and the people who know the truth about the alien spores, used the ruins long ago to build a divine city floating in the stratosphere. That is Central Eden City, a forbidden zone of self-proclaimed gods. They stole 90% of Earth's ancient crystal cores, and they're even carrying out horrific experiments in an attempt to control higher dimensional will. And the most perfect one-of-a-kind origin sequence awakening within me is exactly the ultimate specimen those mad scientists dream of dissecting. If they detect the energy fluctuations from Skyvault's destruction, Eden City's Judgment Angel Legion will definitely mobilize in full force." As I listened to my old man's explanation, I felt no fear at all. Instead, the fighting spirit inside me that had just settled down erupted like a volcano. For the past 10 years, my old man and I survived like dogs in the wasteland, branded by those hypocritical conglomerates as damned mutant monsters, turned into damned mutant monsters. Now that I hold the power of the gods, how could I be content ruling over ruins? I clenched my dark gold fist, strong enough to crush a mech with ease, and a cold smile curled at the corner of my mouth, making the air around me turn icy. Since they call themselves gods and treat us like pitiful insects, then I'll personally fight my way up into the stratosphere and smash that divine throne to pieces. My old man looked at me, the madness in his eyes, then threw his head back and burst into wild laughter. He said, "That is my boy, born from Lu Zhantian's blood. If we're doing this, we're tearing heaven and earth apart." My old man's massive tiger claw slammed toward the depths of the Kangqiong's underground hangar. He actually dug a metal vault out from deep beneath the earth's core. It was a warship that would be called a miracle even in the wasteland era. My old man said this was a treasure he risked his life to seize 10 years ago. As long as we have enough high-tier crystal cores to power this warship, we can break through the atmosphere and strike right at Eden City's doorstep. I looked at this terrifying beast of war, gleaming with a dark sheen, and without hesitation threw all the mech cores I'd collected into the power chamber. But it was still nowhere near enough to awaken this giant that had slumbered for countless ages. My old man turned his tiger head and looked toward the deepest reaches at the end of the wasteland. He said, "In the far north, there is a terrifying abyssal rift. A calamity-class star beast that has lived for over 1,000 years lurks there. As long as we dig out its destruction crystal core, this warship can be reborn." But even my old man at the peak of his power wouldn't dare go there lightly. The frost breath it exhales can freeze an entire heavy mech squad in an instant. I said nothing. I only looked coldly toward that dead zone forever shrouded in wind and snow. To me now, there is no monster my fists can't shatter. I leaped onto my old man's broad, pure white tiger back, as vast as a plaza. That pure white tiger back, as vast as a plaza, commanding the terrifying army of 10,000 beasts behind us, as we surged toward the northern abyss. Every human scavenger convoy and small mobile bastion along the way was so terrified they pissed themselves on the spot. They frantically called for help over the public channel. A few days later, our army finally entered the absolute zero zone of the far north. The air here was so cold that even steel instantly became as brittle as glass. The blizzard was filled with high-speed ice blades that could easily tear a human body apart. Even high-tier star beasts with their thick hides couldn't endure it and collapsed. I directly activated the partial origin Titan body to shield my entire body. The Titan body shielded my entire body. The dark old scales gave off a searing glow in the storm, fighting off the bitter cold. Just as we were about to approach the giant ice cavern at the abyss core, a row of clear footprints suddenly appeared on the vast white snowfield ahead. My old man's enormous body came to an abrupt stop, letting out a low, warning growl. He said those footprints didn't belong to any mutant beast, but were made by something highly advanced. I took a closer look and saw that the edges of the footprints were extremely clean cut. They were clearly marks left by some kind of anti-gravity hovering humanoid armor. Could it be that people from central Eden City had already found this calamity beast ahead of us? Just as that alarming thought flashed through my mind, a shrill, inhuman scream suddenly came from deep in the blizzard ahead. Right after that, a massive blue beam of energy shot into the sky. It blasted a huge hole straight through the ancient ice clouds over the abyss. That kind of terrifying power was far beyond what an ordinary mech's main cannon could produce. It was more than 10 times stronger than the Starbreaker cannon the City Lord used before. Dad immediately hid his massive body behind a huge iceberg. I quietly made my way toward the source of the energy burst. When I lay at the edge of the ice cavern and got a clear look at what was happening below, even though I had already awakened the divine sequence, I still couldn't help gasping. At the bottom of the abyss, that calamity beast, as large as 2 aircraft carriers, was actually being pinned down by several sharp chains glowing with holy white light. Its body was covered in horrifying wounds so deep the bones showed. Blue blood flowed like a river, and the one holding down this 1,000-year monster, that even Dad was wary of, was actually a stunning silver-haired woman wearing only a thin white coat. She wasn't piloting any, not even the lowest grade wasteland mech. Yet she floated in midair, more than 10 meters above the ground, like a god descending to Earth. Behind her spread 6 pairs of wings of light made entirely of high-dimensional psionic energy. She looked exactly like the 6-winged angel described in human mythology. She coldly looked at the starry sky behemoth beneath her feet as it struggled madly, trying to resist, then extended a slender, flawless pale finger and tapped lightly. The beast's incredibly hard skull was instantly pierced like tofu. An ice-blue crystal core radiating a terrifying aura of destruction was forcibly pulled out by her. I stared at this mysterious silver-haired woman who had instantly killed the calamity beast with her bare hands. The origin sequence, inside me, sent out an overwhelmingly frantic warning for the first time. It was an extreme instinctive reaction to encountering an absolute natural enemy that could threaten my life. Just as I was about to quietly retreat and discuss a plan with Dad, the 6-winged woman in midair suddenly turned her head. Those ice-blue eyes, devoid of any human emotion, actually crossed the wind, snow, and vast distance, locked onto my exact position. A cold, mechanical voice boomed inside my head. "Found you. The ultimate perfect test subject of origin sequence. One." That cold voice seemed to carry a kind of mental piercing force. I felt a violent shock deep inside my brain. But the origin sequence inside me immediately burst into brilliant light. Dark gold energy instantly crushed that mental intrusion. Dad's massive white tiger body suddenly took a step forward, His overwhelming pressure turned into a storm and blew away the surrounding wind and snow. Dad let out a thunderous warning roar, fixing a fierce stare on the silver-haired woman hovering in midair. But the six-winged angel didn't take Dad's pressure seriously at all. The wings of light behind her gave just a slight flap, and she instantly vanished from where she was, leaving behind a spatial afterimage. My neural reaction speed had already reached the limit of carbon-based life, but I could still only catch the faint ripples left in the air. My danger instinct made me instantly activate Titan Overlord Body, Stage 2. Dark gold scales covered every inch of my skin in an instant. At the exact instant, the tough scales had just formed. A pale hand was already pressed against my chest without any warning. There was no earth-shattering blast, and no dazzling light show, just an eruption of pure higher-dimensional energy. My supposedly indestructible Titan body let out a muffled groan. It was as if I'd been hit by a meteor, and I was sent violently flying backward, straight into the unbelievably hard ancient glacier behind me. Huge sections of the thick black ice shattered and exploded into a storm of flying ice shards. Using the rebound force, I managed to steady myself again in the wreckage. Dad was both shocked and furious. He swung his massive tiger paw down through the air. Golden metal chi turned into a sky full of blades and cut off her retreat. A trace of complex data flashed through the woman's ice-blue eyes. The space around her actually began to warp in a strange way. Dad's attack, powerful enough to smash a heavy fortress, slid straight off to the side. Several towering ice peaks in the distance were instantly leveled by the aftermath. Is this the power of Central Eden City's Judgment Angel? This level of control over space and energy is simply unbelievable. But I will never back down before a false god acting so high and mighty. I drove my legs down hard and shattered the ice beneath me. As I shot forward like lightning, my right arm gathered all the power of the origin sequence. I slammed it hard into her shield, just when I thought she couldn't block it, and was about to pull back for the moment. The 6 wings of light behind him suddenly turned into 6 enormous chains of light. They pierced through space in an instant and locked Dad's massive limbs tightly in place. Dad let out a furious roar and struggled with all his might, but he couldn't move at all. The woman's cold, merciless gaze locked onto me again. You're nothing more than an unfinished, low-level energy vessel. An extremely dangerous high-dimensional sword of light formed out of thin air in her hand. Aimed at my head, it came slashing straight down with enough force to tear through anything. A deadly sense of danger made me forcibly twist my body to avoid a fatal blow. The sword of light grazed my shoulder and sent up a shower of blinding sparks. Even the Titan scales were left with a deep white gash. I gritted my teeth through the sharp pain and clamped my left hand tightly around the edge of the sword of light. I once again pushed the devouring instinct of the origin sequence into overdrive. I actually began forcibly absorbing the high-dimensional spiritual energy from the sword of light. For the first time, in the woman's impassive eyes, a look of astonishment appeared. She clearly hadn't expected an experimental subject like me to be able to devour her power. Taking advantage of that brief moment of distraction, my dark gold claws went straight for her face, but my real target was the Calamity Beast crystal core in her hand. My claws suddenly changed course in midair, tracing a strange arc, and snatched that icy blue crystal core radiating a destructive aura. After losing the crystal core, the woman quickly retreated and steadied herself in midair. The blue streams of data in her eyes began flickering at a wildly frantic speed. She stared at me coldly and said, "Do you really think you can escape like this?" The moment she finished speaking, the wings of light behind her began burning violently. A massive phantom city appeared above the entire far north abyss. That was Central Eden City, the ultimate energy projection spanning space. Countless destructive beams began wildly converging within the city's phantom. Dad broke free of the chains with all his strength and roared, telling me to take Jinhee and get out now. He transformed into a pure white giant shield and threw himself across my escape route. I didn't dare hesitate for even a moment. Clutching the cold crystal core, I ran for my life. A devastating surge of energy erupted behind us in an instant. Countless glaciers were instantly vaporized under the indiscriminate barrage of light beams. Relying on our powerful bodies, we forced our way out of the center of the blast. By the time we got back to where the ancient sleeping warship lay, we were both in pretty rough shape. But thankfully, neither of us had suffered any irreversible injuries. My old man's originally snow-white fur was now scorched black in places. Through gritted teeth, he said, "Those lunatics actually turned themselves into terminals." Without hesitation, I threw that Calamity crystal core into the warship's reactor, together with the core energy we'd gathered earlier. It finally reached the activation threshold. A low, humming sound slowly rose from deep within the warship's metal hull. as if an ancient beast that had slept for countless ages were waking up. Mysterious dim blue patterns lit up across the armor on the warship's surface. A massive anti-gravity force slowly lifted the warship out of the ice. My old man stood in the spacious command room, his eyes gleaming with feverish excitement. Target the stratosphere. Today, we're going to flatten that divine city once and for all. The warship turned into a blinding streak of light and tore through the ice clouds that had lingered for 10,000 years, toward the space above Earth's atmosphere. It shot forward at an unbelievable speed. The warship's internal gravity simulation system worked perfectly. We stared at the stratospheric coordinates on the screen as they drew closer and closer. At last, Eden City's true form appeared above the clouds. It was a majestic city built entirely from crystal and special alloys. Countless heavy defensive fortresses floated around it like satellites. Just when I thought the warship would slip through the defense line undetected, the warship's main control screen suddenly flickered twice and turned blood red. A huge, cold human face appeared on the screen in a bizarre way. That face was exactly the same as the six-winged angel we had just encountered. In an emotionless synthetic voice, she announced the intruders would be eliminated. In an instant, all of the warship's weapons systems and shields completely failed. And that wasn't all. The reactor's temperature began to spike at an extremely abnormal rate. Someone had forcibly seized the highest level of control remotely from outside. My old man anxiously pounded on the control console and tried to cut the external connection, but it was useless. I took a deep breath and slammed my scale-covered right hand onto the main console. Dark gold, origin energy, surging through my arm and into the battleship's systems. Using a life magnetic field from the highest dimension, I forcibly overwrote the enemy AI code. Two completely different forces clashed violently inside the battleship's neural network. The battleship lurched violently through the stratosphere, as if it could come apart in midair at any moment. I gritted my teeth and pushed the origin sequence's processing power to the absolute limit. Finally, after a blinding burst of internal sparks, that eerie human face let out a sharp grating electronic shriek. The screen returned to the dim blue glow that signaled safe status. I had successfully regained control, but the battleship's position was completely exposed. The defensive bastions around Eden City instantly went into full combat mode. Dense anti-air energy arrays locked onto the airspace around us. Tens of thousands of destructive beams wove together into a death net with no blind spots. Dad made a split-second decision and personally took over the battleship's manual flight controls. The massive, ancient battleship moved like a nimble loach in Dad's hands. Through the gaps in the dense beams, he pulled off evasive maneuvers that defied all common sense. Meanwhile, I stayed fully focused on controlling the battleship's main gun for precise counterattacks. Dark blue high-energy shells hit those outer defense nodes with perfect accuracy. One brilliant yet deadly burst of energy after another exploded across the sky. This was not just a contest of technology, but a brutal clash of pure energy. We pushed forward under heavy fire and forced our way through the seemingly impregnable defense network. Trailing thick smoke, the battleship smashed straight through Eden City's outer shield. It crashed hard on the edge of the Divine City, onto a massive crystal spaceport plaza. The terrifying impact instantly crushed countless exquisite floating structures. The battleship's warped hatch crashed down. With heavy steps, I walked out in the towering Titan body, radiating a suffocating sense of pressure in the sunlight. Dad also instantly transformed into a 100-meter white tiger and let out an earth-shaking roar, announcing the arrival of the rebels from the wasteland. In this forbidden realm of the gods, dense ranks of silver-white divine city guards quickly poured in around the plaza. They wore advanced high-tech battle armor and carried high-frequency psionic weapons. But in the face of power at my level and my dad's level, they were completely helpless. I casually threw a punch, and the terrifying shockwave sent hundreds of guards flying. My dad was even more unstoppable. With every fierce sweep of his massive tiger claws, whole groups of elite armored guards were smashed on the spot into piles of scrap metal. We pushed forward along the broad Crystal Avenue in the main district, toward the city center. The strange sights we saw along the way left me deeply shaken. This prosperous city had no sign of natural life at all. All the plants and scenery were made of machinery and solidified energy. Even the fleeing civilians looked expressionless and dazed. I noticed that each of them had an energy tube plugged into the back of their head, connected to the clouds above. This was no sacred temple at all, but a massive fake farm. Just when I thought we could charge straight into the inner city in one push, the grand buildings on both sides of Crystal Avenue suddenly began to twist into something extremely bizarre. Hundreds of semi-biomechanical creatures shaped like hounds burst out, They had no eyes on their heads, only a single huge glowing red eyeball. That eyeball gave off a sickening dark red, corrosive energy glow. My dad easily crushed the first mechanical hound with one swipe of his claws. But the shattered body of that mechanical hound actually sprayed out a thick green toxic mist. After my dad accidentally inhaled the toxic mist, his huge body suddenly staggered. His face changed drastically as he said, "This toxic mist can break down high-dimensional spiritual power. Do not touch it." I immediately deployed the origin sequence's energy barrier to block out the toxic gas. But those mechanical hounds had no intention of fighting us head-on at all. They charged at us like mad, and then self-destructed right outside the shield. The green toxic mist grew thicker and thicker, completely surrounding the street we were on. I could clearly feel the energy shield being corroded rapidly, letting out a hissing sound. If this keeps up, sooner or later, we'll be swallowed by this bizarre toxic mist. My gaze turned cold, and I directly activated the third advanced form of Titan Overlord body. The surface of the originally dark gold scales burst into black flames filled with destruction. This was the strongest destructive power the origin sequence could currently wield. Destruction rock. I slammed both fists into the ground. A ring of raging black fire spread outward, wherever the black rock passed. Those green toxins were instantly burned away without a trace. Those mech hounds that tried to get close and self-destruct were also instantly burned to ashes by the intense heat. As the toxic fog cleared, the massive energy gate to the inner city finally came clearly into view. I strode up to the gate, ready to smash it open with sheer force. Just as my dark gold fist was about to strike the energy gate, strange ripples like water suddenly spread across its surface. A man in a lavish white robe with golden patterns stepped out of the ripples. He wore an exquisite golden mask that covered the upper half of his face. The lips visible beneath the mask curled into a deeply unsettling smile. He looked at me, gave a light clap, and said, "As expected of the perfect number, 001. His voice had a strange magnetism, yet it made me feel extremely dangerous. I said, "Drop the act. Today is the end of your Eden City." The masked man shook his head and said contemptuously, "You know nothing about the truth of this world." He casually snapped his fingers. The energy gate behind him slowly opened to both sides. The shocking sight behind the gate made both me and my old man stop attacking at the same time. It was a massive transparent matrix of cultivation tanks with no visible bottom. Inside floated countless identical human clones, packed tightly together. And those clones all had exactly the same face as me. Their eyes were tightly shut, and their pale bodies were covered with all kinds of extraction tubes. The masked man spread his arms wide and laughed wildly as if showing off a great work of art. "Welcome back to the place where you were born, my proudest ultimate vessel. What the hell is going on? Aren't I my old man's biological son?" I suddenly turned to look at my old man, hoping he'd give me an explanation right away. My old man's massive white tiger body was also trembling slightly in an unnatural way. In his eyes, reflecting golden light, a trace of pain buried for many years flashed by. "Xiaoyuan, it is a long story, but I, Lu Zhantian, really am your father." The masked man burst out laughing. "He cut Dad off without mercy. He just stole a genetic embryo from the lab, and now he really thinks he is your father. You're nothing more than a disposable subject cultivated from fragments of an ancient god's genes. Your existence is only to bear the descent of the supreme higher dimensional will." Hearing those words that shattered everything I thought I knew, I felt a violent roar explode in my head. These past 10 years, our struggle in the brutal wasteland and the father-son bond that kept us alive, was it all just a carefully planned experiment and a lie from beginning to end? Because of the violent emotional turmoil, the origin energy inside me started raging completely out of control. Just when I thought I was about to completely lose my mind, Dad suddenly let out a grief-filled, furious roar that shook the entire dome of the divine city. His massive body suddenly burst into a blinding white origin flame. Without a second thought, he charged at the arrogant man in the golden mask. No one gets to deny the bond we've shared, surviving together in the wasteland for these past 10 years. Go to hell, you disgusting hypocrites who treat life like it is worthless. This strike, fueled by Dad burning his life force, was terrifyingly powerful. Pure metal aura transformed into an even larger, more solid phantom tiger, its huge jaws opening wide enough to swallow a warship, trying to blast the masked man and the gate to pieces. The masked man let out a cold laugh and stood where he was, with no intention of dodging at all. Behind him, the matrix of incubation pods suddenly lit up, with tens of thousands of eerie red lights. Hundreds upon hundreds of my clones opened their eyes all at once. In perfect unison, they actually threw dark golden punches almost identical to mine. Hundreds upon hundreds of counterfeit Titan power merged into a terrifying river of energy and slammed into Dad's white tiger phantom high above the plaza. The blinding light plunged the entire city's surveillance system into a brief blind spot. The violent energy explosion sent both Dad and me flying backward. Dad crashed heavily onto the crystal floor, his aura becoming extremely weak. The imposing layer of white fur covering his body had already lost its original luster. I rushed over at once and poured pure origin energy into his body to stabilize his injuries. Dad looked at me, gave me a bitter smile, and said, "You little troublemaker. Don't listen to that bastard's nonsense. What does blood relation even matter? You're the only son I, Lu Zhantian, will ever have." Seeing how weak yet resolute Dad looked, all the confusion in my heart vanished in an instant. In its place was an endless blaze of fury 100 times stronger than before. I don't care who created me, or what kind of bullshit higher dimensional energy vessel I am. I only know who it was that, over the past 10 brutal years in the wasteland, risked his life to protect me and raise me. I slowly rose to my feet and looked straight at that masked man still sitting high above. The black flames of destruction around me turned incandescent white from the sheer intensity of my rage. I looked at him and said, one word at a time. No matter what disgusting descent plan you have, today I'm going to smash this place until not a single building crystal is left intact. Seeing this, the masked man's eyes finally flashed with a trace of barely noticeable seriousness. He coldly gave the order. Since the defective product is out of control, destroy it physically at once. At his command, hundreds, even thousands of clones rushed out like zombies. Though they had no independent thoughts, their combat instincts had been programmed to a terrifying level. Each one had physical strength on par with my first stage Titan form. I let out a long howl that pierced the sky and transformed into an invincible dark gold war god. Facing the clone army surging toward me like a black tide, I charged straight into them. There were no flashy energy moves, only the purest clash of brute force. With one punch, I shattered a clone's defensive armor and sent him flying. Then I grabbed another clone by the arm and swung him in a full arc into the crowd. Even though they had the same face as me, I felt no pity at all, because they were nothing but Cold War expendables whose souls had been erased. But I soon realized that these clones could actually share tactical vision through a network. Their attacks were coordinated flawlessly, gradually forcing me into a tough defensive fight. Under the barrage of repeated heavy blows, cracks began to appear across my Titan scales, and the incandescent flames, drained by the enormous energy consumption, had grown a little dim. The masked man stood atop his lofty throne, watching it all unfold, with a smug, cold sneer. Just when I thought my only option was to detonate the origin core inside me and take them down with me, the artificial sky above Eden City was suddenly ripped open by a massive rift. A black starship 10 times larger than our battleship forced its way down. Without warning, an intensely blinding deep purple beam shot from the underside of the starship. The beam was like a divine sword, precisely covering the area where the clones and I were. The instant the clones came into contact with the purple light, they dissolved into countless specks of light. They didn't even have the slightest chance to struggle or resist. Before being completely erased on a physical level, I felt an extremely gentle, but irresistible pulling force, slowly lifting me up. A strange female voice, filled with supreme authority, and a bold commanding presence echoed across the city sky. I'd like to see who in this universe dares lay a hand on the child of hope the Starsea Resistance has been desperately searching for. When the masked man saw the black starship blotting out the sky, his face instantly turned deathly pale. In sheer terror, he cried out, "The Starsea Resistance? How could you possibly have found this place?" No one on the starship answered. There was only the terrifying howl of the main cannon charging wildly. A pure white beam powerful enough to destroy heaven and earth shot straight at Eden City's central command tower. It was a dimensional strike countless times more terrifying than the Starbreaker cannon of the Kangxiong City Lord main gun. A massive ring of energy exploded at the heart of the city, overturning countless airborne fortresses. The masked man didn't even have time to let out a scream before he was completely swallowed by the blinding light. I seized the chance to hoist up my badly wounded old man who had changed back into human form and followed the purple beam into the starship. The technology inside the black starship had already gone far beyond the limits of my understanding. A woman in a black skin-tight combat suit with sharp red hair walked up to me. She looked at me, her eyes holding a trace of complicated relief and comfort. "Let me introduce myself. I am Hong Lian, Supreme Commander of the Resistance's 7th Fleet. We have spent a full 10 years searching for you. The perfect origin vessel. She led me through the metal corridor. She led me into the newly built hyperdimensional medical chamber. She took my unconscious old man and placed him in recovery fluid filled with green life essence. Then she turned to look at me and told me the truth in an extremely serious tone. Those people in Eden City who call themselves gods are nothing but puppets being used by someone else. The real mastermind behind it all is a high-dimensional crystalline parasitic life form hiding on the dark side of the moon. They use Eden City to harvest Earth's spiritual energy as they prepare to completely purge the entire planet. And the perfect origin sequence awakened within you is the only key to ending them. As I listened to the shocking secret Hong Lian revealed, I felt myself being drawn into an even bigger vortex. But I had no thought of backing down. I clenched my dark gold fist tightly and stared into her eyes as I said, no matter where the real enemy is, I'll smash them to pieces. Hong Lian nodded in approval and said, before that, you need to undergo real training. Right now, your origin sequence is operating entirely on instinct, and you've developed less than 10% of its potential. Next, I'll take you to the Resistance's secret base for Hell-level special training. Above the blazing ruins of Eden City, the black starship slowly turned its massive bow engines and emitted a blue spatial curvature glow. In an instant, it became a streak of light and shot out of the atmosphere, heading toward the vast, boundless depths of the universe filled with countless unknowns and terrifying dangers. The black starship's curvature engine let out a low rumble. Outside the porthole, the starlight stretched into dazzling bands. I stood in silence before the massive holographic star map in the main control room. Hong Lian walked over to me and handed me a cup of green nutrient fluid. She said, "This is a recovery serum extracted from pure stellar energy." I took the cup and drank it in one gulp. I could feel the power filling my body. After the starship had traveled at faster than light speed for who knew how long, it finally slowed to a stop deep within a chaotic asteroid belt. The meteorites here had a strange dark purple metallic sheen. Pointing at the largest shattered meteorite, Hong Lian said, "We're here." Complex unlocking beams shot from the front of the starship and swept across the meteorite's surface. The lifeless meteorite slowly split open to either side, revealing a massive underground steel starport inside. Countless oddly shaped warships moved in and out of the new port. This is the Resistance's main hidden base, concealed for centuries. I followed Hong Lian off the starship and stepped onto the solid alloy deck. The Resistance fighters around me all looked at me with awe. They whispered to each other, "So this is the perfect origin vessel." I ignored their stares and headed straight for the medical wing. Old Dad was still asleep in the recovery pod. I had to make sure he was safe. Hong Lian seemed to read my mind and told me not to worry. He said Old Dad's vital signs had fully stabilized. Just as I finally breathed a sigh of relief and was about to ask about the special training, a piercing top-level red alarm suddenly blared throughout the entire port. Just when I thought this hidden headquarters was completely secure, the young soldier beside me who was guiding us suddenly let out a scream. The surface of his skin started crystallizing at a visible rate. Sharp, dark blue crystals burst out from his veins. The soldiers around him recoiled in fear and raised their energy guns. Hong Lian's face changed instantly. He shouted that it was a resonance from a high-dimensional crystal parasite. He drew the pulse light sword from his waist, ready to put the soldier out of his misery. I grabbed his wrist and said, "Wait, I might be able to save him." Without hesitation, I activated the first stage of Titan Overlord form. Dark golden scales covered the palm of my right hand. I grabbed the shoulder of the soldier who was crystallizing out of control. I instantly drove the devouring instinct of the origin sequence to its limit. An overwhelmingly violent force surged through every part of his body. Those dark blue crystals that had been growing wildly actually stopped spreading. The high-dimensional parasitic energy was forcibly stripped from his body by the power of origin and traveled up my arm into the energy core in my chest. The soldier collapsed to the ground in pain, gasping for air. Although he lost half an arm, at least he survived. Hong Lian watched me casually neutralize the deadly crystal infection. His eyes blazed with an unprecedented fervor and hope. He said, "You really are our final trump card against the dark side of the moon. That resonance just now means the enemy has already noticed your presence. They're using high-dimensional broadcasting to try to pinpoint our coordinates. We're out of time. The special training has to begin immediately." I followed Hong Lian through heavily guarded underground passageways to the deepest part of the base, where a massive gravity isolation chamber door stood. The terrifying energy waves coming from behind it made my scales stand on end. Honglian said grimly. This is the Resistance's ultimate trial, the Abyssal Furnace. Inside, it simulates the dark side of the moon's most extreme high-dimensional crystal pressure environment. Even the Resistance's most elite warriors can't hold out for more than 3 minutes. I looked at the heavy alloy door and let out a cold sneer. I said, if we're going to shatter the Divine Throne, then a trial like this is just right. The door slowly opened, and a visible gravity wave slammed into me. I didn't hesitate for a second and stepped straight into the furnace. The alloy door slammed shut behind me, locking me completely inside. The surroundings instantly turned into a dark blue crystal wasteland. The air was thick, with almost tangible high-dimensional radiation energy. It felt like tens of thousands of tons of steel were pressing down on my shoulders. Even breathing felt as painful as swallowing shattered glass. I immediately activated the second stage of Titan Overlord form to cover my entire body in scales. The dark gold glow looked especially bright in the dark blue space. The furnace's system AI gave a cold countdown alert. The first wave of crystal energy tides will hit in 10 seconds. I bent my knees slightly and took the most effective defensive stance to absorb the impact. With a thunderous boom, the crystal ground around me suddenly exploded apart. Countless blue blades of light filled with high-dimensional energy swept through like a storm. I swung my dark gold fists and fought wildly against the storm of light blades. Every collision sent out blinding sparks and waves of energy. Under the extreme pressure, the origin sequence began evolving wildly on its own. I could feel my cells greedily absorbing that compressed energy. This kind of brutal pressure on the edge of life and death made my blood boil. Just when I thought I had fully adapted to the furnace's extreme pressure, the dark blue crystals throughout the entire simulation space suddenly melted in a strange way. An enormous, transparent crystal, a gigantic claw reached straight out of the void. This wasn't a simulation program, but a real cross-dimensional projection of a higher-dimensional life form. The sickening aura of the parasites from the dark side of the moon rushed right at me. That giant claw carried a terrifying pressure strong enough to crush stars. As it came slashing down at me, under that pressure, even my Titan scales began to let out a mournful cry. But instead of crushing the fighting spirit in my heart, it completely ignited it. I threw back my head and let out an unyielding roar. Then activated my third form. My dark gold body instantly ignited with white-hot flames of destruction. I slammed my legs down, shattering the virtual crystal ground beneath my feet, and shot upward like a white meteor. I charged straight at that terrifying giant claw. The Eye of Destruction and the high-dimensional crystal collided violently in midair. There was no deafening boom, only a black hole that swallowed even light. I gathered all the origin power in my body into my right fist and unleashed it with everything I had. Break, I gritted my teeth and let out a roar like an ancient demon god. Then came an unbelievably sharp crack of shattering crystal, and that arrogant crystal giant claw was blasted to pieces by my punch. The violent recoil not only destroyed the cross-dimensional projection link, it also blew the entire gravity isolation chamber of the abyssal furnace to pieces. The underground base's incredibly thick alloy wall was blasted open with a huge hole. Amid the smoke and the shrill alarms, I slowly walked out. The white-hot flames on my body gradually died down and returned to dark gold scales. Honglian and a group of high-ranking resistance leaders stared at me in the ruins, dumbfounded. The way they looked at me was like they were staring at a monster that had completely shattered all common sense. Honglian swallowed hard and asked me in a trembling voice, "You actually blew up the supposedly indestructible abyssal furnace from the inside?" I casually brushed the metal debris off my shoulder and said calmly, "A toy at this level can no longer bring out my sequence potential, since those high-dimensional parasites are already so eager to die. Then we'll head straight for the dark side of the moon. We'll wipe them out at the root." Honglian took a deep breath, her eyes turning firm and burning with zeal. "All right, our entire 7th Fleet will follow Origin to the death." 3 days later, a specially modified assault starship left the main base. The starship was equipped with the rebels' most advanced energy shields and anti-radar systems. Our target was the crystal parasite brood nest deep on the far side of the moon. With the help of the restorative fluid, Dad had fully recovered to his peak condition. He stood beside me, looking at the moon, Earth's closest satellite on the star map. "Xiaoyuan, this time your old man will lead the charge. The two of us, father and son, are going to tear apart their nest." In the dark depths of space, the starship sped forward swiftly and silently. As we got closer and closer to the moon, a heavy sense of dread settled over me. From space, the far side of the moon was nothing like a barren wasteland of craters. Instead, it was completely wrapped in an enormous, extremely thick purple-black crystal shell. Countless crystal conduits, like tentacles, ran deep into the moon's core. They were frantically draining the last bit of the moon's core energy. Honglian worked the controls quickly. The starship entered silent cloaking mode. We're about to pass through the outer high-dimensional energy barrier of the crystal shell. Everyone must activate your personal energy shields. To prevent mental contamination, I looked at the massive purple-black crystals outside the porthole, sickening to behold, and the devouring instinct of the origin sequence began to stir again, letting out a hungry roar. Like an invisible steel needle, the starship quietly slipped through a gap in the defensive net. Just as we were about to land on the moon's surface, every radar screen on the console suddenly turned to static at the same time. Just when I thought our cloaking system was enough to fool every scan, a sudden sound came from above the starship. A deafening crash that seemed like it would tear the ship apart. A crystal ancient dragon more than 500 meters long slammed directly onto the armor. Its incredibly sharp crystal claws instantly tore through the starship's cloaking layer. Cold high-dimensional soulfire burned in its enormous dark purple eye sockets. Honglian cried out, "This is bad." It is the brood nest's ultimate guardian, the Injustice Prison Nether Dragon. It opened its gaping maw made of countless crystal clusters and blasted out a destructive breath. The purple-black dragon breath instantly melted the starship's thick outer energy armor. Alarms inside the starship blared wildly. The gravity system inside the cabin failed instantly. I grabbed Honglian just as she was about to be sucked out into space and threw her toward the safe zone. Dad let out a furious roar. He instantly turned into a pure white giant tiger over 100 meters long inside the cabin. He leaped straight out into the fierce wind from the starship being torn apart to face that terrifying nether dragon. I also activated Titan Overdrive without a moment's hesitation and charged into space right behind him. In the airless vacuum of space, we could only communicate through our minds. Dad's white tiger form looked somewhat small in front of the 500-meter nether dragon, but he fearlessly swung his Jang metal giant claws and slammed them hard into the nether dragon's skeleton. With a burst of blinding light, one of the nether dragon's ribs was shattered on the spot, but the nether dragon felt no pain at all. It whipped its tail back into Dad. The tremendous force sent Dad flying and crashing through a crystal crater. A cold glint flashed in my eyes. The dark gold scales on my back suddenly burst out of my body. They turned into two pairs of overbearing dragon wings made entirely of origin energy. This was the new form of the origin sequence I had just grasped in the abyssal furnace. With one powerful beat of my wings, I left an afterimage across space and closed in instantly. I landed directly on the nether dragon's broad back. My fists ignited with white-hot flames. "Get down and stay down." I swung both fists and slammed them down wildly like a pile driver. Every punch carried enough terrifying force to flatten a mountain range. The nether dragon's hard crystal spine began to crack bit by bit under my relentless blows. It twisted its massive body in pain, trying to throw me off its back, but I clung to it like a parasite on the bone. My legs clamped tightly around its crystal bones. With both hands, I grabbed the core source at the back of its neck. The soul crystal's devouring instinct fully kicked in. I began frantically absorbing this nether dragon's high-dimensional energy. The nether dragon let out a silent soul roar and rolled wildly through space as it struggled. The high-dimensional radiation pouring off its body was enough to drive an ordinary person insane in an instant. But the origin core, inside me, was like a black hole that could never be filled. It continuously turned that deadly radiation into fuel for my evolution. In just a few seconds, the nether dragon's resistance started visibly weakening. The cold soulfire in its eye sockets also grew dim like a candle about to go out in the wind. I let out a furious roar and put all my strength into both arms. With a crack, I ripped that crystal right out. With its core gone, the nether dragon instantly fell apart into countless specks of purple cosmic dust. I hovered in space and crushed the crystal full of immense energy, absorbing it completely. The origin sequence's evolution level surged again. I could feel that I was only a hair's breadth from perfection. Dad flew out of the shattered crater and shook the purple stardust off himself. He laughed and said through voice transmission, "Nicely done. Just what I'd expect from the son Lujantian is proudest of." The crisis was over. Honglian piloted the badly damaged starship and barely managed to land on the crystal ground. The three of us stood on the dark side of the moon, on that suffocating purple-black land. Ahead of us stood a massive crystal peak tens of thousands of meters tall, stretching straight into the void of space. Honglian pointed at the peak and said, "That is the main brood nest of the higher dimensional parasites. As long as we destroy the crystal heart inside, we can completely cut off their control over Earth. I took a deep breath and steadied the vast violent energy I had just absorbed into my body. Let's go meet these so-called higher dimensional gods who treat humans like containers. We followed the cracks in the crystal peak, all the way down into the brood nest's underground core. The walls around us were densely packed, with all kinds of creatures encased in crystal. There were not only mutated beasts from Earth, but also many unknown races from across the universe. They had all been turned into the brood nests, disgusting incubators for hatching higher dimensional larvae. Dad's eyes were burning with rage at the sight, as if he wanted nothing more than to smash this whole place to pieces with one swipe. Suddenly, the passage ahead opened up into a huge underground plaza. Floating in the center of the plaza was a beating heart as massive as a small planet. It was a heart made entirely of purple crystal, and every beat shook the surrounding space. And beneath the heart, below it, stood 12 mysterious figures in purple robes. They were the higher dimensional parasites, the 12 highest high priests in this star sector. The lead high priest slowly turned his head. Under the hood was a constantly shifting nebula. He spoke to us in a layered voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. Foolish low-dimensional creatures, and you dare come to us on your own. You will become great sacrifices. I let out a cold sneer and mocked them without mercy. You parasites who only dare hide in the shadows. Today, I'll use your crystal core heart as a stepping stone for my origin sequence. I struck first. With a beat of my dark old dragon wings, I shot forward like a meteor, heading straight for the lead high priest. All 12 high priests raised their crystal staffs at the same time. They put up a combined shield. My fist slammed into the shield, but it only caused a faint ripple. The shield was far tougher than I'd imagined. It could completely absorb physical force. The high priest let out a scornful laugh and said, "In the face of absolute laws, strength is just a joke." A blinding purple light lit up at the tips of their staffs. It locked onto the three of us. 12 devastating high-dimensional disintegration rays, wove together into a deadly net. These rays could directly, at the atomic level, break matter down completely into elementary particles. Dad's face went pale with shock. He tried to step in front of me, but I yanked him behind me. My eyes instantly turned pure gold. The origin core inside me started spinning wildly. If physical attacks don't work, then I'll use higher dimensional spatial laws against you. I suddenly brought my hands together in front of my chest. I forcibly tore open a spatial rift in front of me. Those 12 deadly disintegration rays were all sucked into the chaotic extra-dimensional space. The high priest's laughter stopped short. A ripple of disbelief passed through that nebula. How can you possibly control spatial folding? The cosmic law of the highest dimension. I didn't give them a chance to keep talking. I crossed space in an instant and appeared behind them. My claws, wreathed in flames of destruction, pierced straight through the energy bodies of 2 high priests. The high priests I struck didn't even let out a scream before they turned into puddles of purple energy sludge. The combined shield collapsed instantly. Dad seized the chance and transformed into a white tiger as he pounced. His metal tiger claws were like a meat grinder, tearing through the remaining priests in a bloody massacre. Honglian also drew her pulse lightsaber and provided precise covering fire and cleanup from the rear. In just 2 minutes, we slaughtered all 12 of those lofty high priests. I shook the lingering energy off my claws and strode toward that enormous crystal heart. As long as I destroyed it, this parasitic war spanning countless light years would finally be completely over. I raised my right fist, packed with all the power of origin sequence, ready to deliver the killing blow. Just as I thought that crystal heart was about to be completely smashed to pieces by me, a sudden scream from a human woman came from inside the heart, filled with utter agony and despair. Then the surface of the purple crystal turned transparent, revealing the figure sealed inside. It was actually Lin Wan, who had been swallowed by the mutated beast horde at Human Bastion half a month ago. Her whole body was covered with purple IV tubes, and she stared at me with lifeless eyes. "Lu Yuan, save me. I know I was wrong. Please don't kill me. I don't want to die yet." Her weak voice came straight through the high-dimensional psychic link into my mind. Honglian was shocked and said, "The broodmother actually used your former partner as the heart's final shield. The moment you shatter this heart, that woman's soul will be torn to pieces instantly." Dad frowned too and said, "These bastards are vicious. They actually resorted to this kind of psychological tactic." I looked at the woman inside the crystal heart, the woman I had once given everything for. Looking at that face that had once been so proud, now twisted with fear, I felt nothing at all. If anything, I found it a little ridiculous. I turned to look at Honglian and Dad. My voice was calm, like I was talking about something minor. Do you really think the life or death of a traitor, like her, could threaten someone who is about to become a god? Without hesitation, I raised my fist. Without slowing down at all, I drove it straight into the crystal core. Linwan's desperate scream sounded so shrill under the force of my punch, and yet so insignificant. I looked into her eyes, full of venom and resentment, and curled my lips into a cold, mocking smile. I told you before, in my life, you don't even count as an insignificant speck of dust. With a thunderous boom, a terrifying blast that shattered the moon's entire core, my origin sequence surged with white-hot flames that could destroy everything, and pierced straight through the crystal core. Linwan's body and soul were instantly reduced to ashes in that violent surge of energy. Not a single trace was left behind. Just like her vile life, she was completely erased. The enormous purple crystal core began an irreversible chain collapse. The violent higher-dimensional energy broke free of its restraints and turned into a storm that swept through the entire underground space. Honglian shouted anxiously, "The brood nest is going to explode. This energy is enough to blow the moon in half. We have to get out of here now, or everyone will be buried along with this satellite." I turned to look at the energy storm still raging wildly, and a trace of desperate madness flashed in my eyes. "You two go first. I'm going to completely devour this massive source of the brood nest and break into the perfect divine realm." Old Man firmly refused and said, "This is too dangerous. That power will make you explode." I forcibly used the law of space to tear open a newly built stable teleportation passage. Without another word, I shoved Old Man and Honglian into it. Then, I sealed off their way back. "Don't worry, Old Man. I told you before. I'm going to break every fixed law in this universe." I turned and faced the raging tide of energy powerful enough to destroy stars. I released the Titan Overlord body and floated at the center of the storm in the purest human form. The origin core in my chest burst with an unprecedented dark gold brilliance. Come on, let me see what this so-called ultimate higher dimensional energy can really do. Just how far it can push me to new heights. The raging purple energy, like a tsunami after a dam burst, came surging wildly into every cell of my body. The pain was thousands of times stronger than any awakening I'd ever gone through before. My bones kept shattering and reforming, and my muscles kept tearing apart and healing. As the pain grew more intense, my consciousness began to fade, as if I were falling into an endless abyss. But I desperately clung to my last shred of clarity, refusing to bow to such a low-level pain. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe it was just an instant, or maybe it was several long centuries. That world-destroying energy storm was actually completely absorbed by me. The purple-black crystal shell on the dark side of the moon lost its energy support and began to peel away and collapse on a massive scale. I slowly opened my eyes in the endless void. My pupils had turned into a deep cosmic starfield. There were no exaggerated scales or overbearing flame effects on my body, just perfectly natural, flawless lines, with a faint dark gold divine radiance flowing across them. This is the origin sequence, the ultimate state of 100% awakening, the body of a cosmic god. I casually raised a hand and gave a light wave, and the shattered void around me miraculously healed on its own. I lowered my head and glanced down. Beneath my feet, it was already riddled with holes, but the moon had finally broken free from its parasitic state. Then I looked up at the vast, boundless stars, and the even deeper universe flickering beyond them. I knew this was not the end. This was only the real beginning of my conquest of the sea of stars with my own fists. I reined in the terrifying power inside me, enough to tear apart a galaxy, and in a flash crossed hundreds of thousands of kilometers of empty space. In an instant, I appeared inside the rebels' battered starship. Honglian and Old Man were anxiously staring at the holographic scanner display. When they saw me appear out of thin air, their eyes widened in disbelief, because not even the slightest trace of energy was leaking from my body. I looked just like an ordinary human from Earth, with no fighting ability at all. But Old Man, as a top-tier Zhengjin white tiger beast, instinct told him that I was 10,000 times more terrifying now than that dark old titan had been before. "You actually survived, and even broke through the limits of life." Honglian stepped forward, excitedly, carefully looking me over in my current state. I gave a slight nod, and was just about to tell them that the brood nest had been completely destroyed, when the starship's highest-level doomsday alarm suddenly started blaring again like crazy. On the holographic star map, the coordinates marking Earth's defenses began flashing a glaring blood-red light. What is going on? Could there still be a hidden high-dimensional parasite node on Earth? Honglian's slender fingers became a blur over the control panel. as she worked frantically. What came up on the screen made every resistance fighter there gasp. On the dark side of the moon, the massive high-dimensional energy collapse caused by the brood nest's destruction had actually, in Earth's synchronous orbit, ripped open an interstellar wormhole, a metal fortress larger than the entire moon, with only 1/3 of its bulk visible, was slowly forcing its way out of that wormhole glowing with an eerie purple light. That was a planet-killer judgment fortress from a high-dimensional civilization. Honglian's voice was trembling. They received the highest-level distress coordinates sent out by the brood nest before it died. They're planning to wipe out the entire solar system that Earth is in from the star map. I looked at the terrifying metal fortress in the image, vast enough to blot out the sky, with not the slightest fear in my eyes. Instead, my fighting spirit burned even hotter. I'd just broken through to the perfect divine realm, so this wreck was perfect for a warm-up. I told Honglian to have the starship withdraw at once to a safe zone near Jupiter's orbit, but my old man suddenly let out a roar and shifted into his beastman form, insisting on going with me. I patted my old man's broad shoulder and said with a smile, "You won't need to step in this time. Let your son show you what a real dimensionality reduction strike looks like." Before I'd even finished speaking, I had already merged into the void again and vanished from inside the starship. When I reappeared above Earth's orbit, the fortress had fully arrived. Its enormous shadow had nearly blocked out all of Earth's sunlight. At the bottom of the fortress, tens of thousands of red annihilation cannon beams lit up. Just as I thought they were about to launch an indiscriminate bombardment on Earth, a psychic wave suddenly rang out from within the fortress, echoing across the entire solar system. "Hand over the perfect origin vessel, or this blue planet will be wiped out completely." I let out a cold sneer. I stepped forward through space as casually as if I were out for a stroll. With every step, a ring of golden ripples spread through space beneath my feet. "I'm right here. If you've got the guts, come out and take it yourselves." My voice wasn't loud, but it rang clearly through every corner of the fortress. The metal fortress's main cannon instantly locked onto me. A dark matter annihilation beam, more than 100 kilometers across, erupted with a thunderous blast. Wherever the beam passed, even space itself was completely reduced to nothingness. Facing this horrifying attack, powerful enough to easily destroy an Earth-like planet, I didn't dodge or activate any kind of energy shield. I simply slowly raised my right hand and lightly tapped the beam with my index finger. A miraculous scene unfolded in the cold, silent vacuum of space. That world-destroying, dark matter beam, the instant it touched my fingertip, actually seemed to hit an absolute law it could never overcome. Wall of size. All its energy was compressed in an instant, and in the end, it turned into a black glass bead. I casually held it between two fingers and toyed with it. The high-dimensional commanders inside the fortress were clearly completely stunned by what they saw. They couldn't understand how a carbon-based life form could possibly stop a Starbreaker cannon shot with his bare hand. I gave them no time to think. With a flick of my hand, I sent the black glass bead flying. The bead turned into a black bolt faster than light and slammed hard into the fortress. With a thunderous boom, an indescribably terrifying explosion lit up space. The fortress's outermost layer, that absolute barrier shield said to withstand even a supernova, actually under this single strike, shattered completely, inch by inch, like a fragile eggshell. Then I spread my arms. The origin core inside me began spinning in reverse. "I'm going to let you arrogant parasites get a taste of being devoured yourselves." A massive dark gold black hole slowly formed behind me. The devouring force pouring out of it instantly enveloped the entire massive fortress. The metal armor on the fortress's exterior began to be uncontrollably sucked into the black hole. Countless high-dimensional life forms were frantically piloting their escape pods, trying to get out of the gravity field. But in the face of this absolute power on the level of a cosmic god, it was all useless. Just when I thought the fortress had completely stopped resisting, the fortress's innermost core suddenly erupted with an extremely familiar aura. It was a fundamental fluctuation of the same kind as the origin sequence inside me, sharing the same source. Right after that, a figure shrouded in blinding white light burst through the fortress's outer hull. He was holding a war spear formed from pure origin energy and drove it at my forehead at a speed that even I found dangerous. My eyes narrowed. I twisted aside and dodged the fatal blow, then grabbed his spear with my backhand. The white light faded, revealing a face that left me utterly shocked. He looked exactly like Lujantian, the father of this body. But I knew he was definitely not my old man, because my dad was still in Jupiter's orbit. "Who are you? Why do you have my dad's face and the aura of origin?" The man looked at me coldly. with not a trace of human emotion in his eyes. I am Unit 000, the first-generation Origin prototype. I am also your genetic template. You rebellious, defective product. Today, the main brain will reclaim you completely. The moment I heard that, the doubts in my heart were instantly replaced by endless fury. So the high-dimensional parasites had not only stolen Earth's spiritual energy, they had also set their sights on my dad's genetic sequence long ago. I don't care what kind of first-generation prototype you are. If you dare use that face to stand against me, then today I'll smash you and the main brain behind you into cosmic dust. I let go of the war spear, and my right fist turned into a dark gold meteor as I slammed it hard into his chest. But he threw a punch too. The two forces of Origin collided violently in space. Now, this was a true clash of gods. The space around us was shattered to pieces by the fight. Although his cosmic divine body wasn't as flawless as mine, the Origin energy inside him was somehow endless, as if it were connected to the entire universe. I quickly realized that he wasn't fighting me with his own power. He was drawing power from the stellar core reactor inside that massive metal fortress. Since you want to turn this into a battle of attrition, then I'll give you what you want, you soulless puppet. I stopped holding back. The dark old black hole behind me instantly grew 10 times larger. I wasn't just devouring the fortress's armor. I was swallowing up the energy it released too. At last, a hint of pain from his machine core overloading appeared on his face. The instant his movement stalled, I was already right up on him, directly in front of him. I clamped both hands tightly onto his shoulders and slammed him hard into the metal fortress. The tremendous impact blew a huge hole straight through the fortress's thick outer shell. I followed right behind, turning into a streak of dark gold light and charging into the fortress's inner passageways. I was going to completely tear apart this star-destroying weapon of a higher dimensional civilization from the inside. Inside the fortress was an enormous mechanical maze. Countless blue-glowing higher-dimensional combat machines surged toward me like a tide of insects. But in the face of absolute divine power, numbers had already lost all meaning. With every punch I threw, a huge swarm of machine insects was instantly vaporized into nothing. Following that familiar source, aura, I fought my way to the deepest part of the fortress. At last, I arrived in an enormous, majestic metal hall. The first-generation prototype, wearing my father's face, stood in the center of the hall. Behind it floated a strange polyhedron glowing with 9-colored light. The polyhedron seemed almost alive, pulsing non-stop, and giving off the power of law. The prototype wiped the golden blood from the corner of its mouth and pointed at the polyhedron as it said to me, "This is the supreme core of our higher dimensional civilization, the omniscient and omnipotent cosmic cube. As long as the cube still exists, I can be reborn endlessly, and my power will double." The moment it finished speaking, its damaged body instantly returned to perfect condition. Even the Origin aura around it had fully doubled from just moments ago. I narrowed my eyes slightly and stared at that so-called omniscient and omnipotent cosmic cube. I said, "There is no such thing in this world as an invincible, omniscient, omnipotent existence. And if there is, it can only be these fists of mine that can shatter every law." I suddenly drove both legs hard into the ground, and the metal floor of the entire hall buckled deeply under my step. I was like a raging supernova, charging straight at that first-generation prototype. It let out a furious roar and swung its battle spear, trying to stop my unstoppable attack. But against the ultimate Origin power of my full awakening, it was nothing. With one punch, I snapped its Origin battle spear, then followed up with a kick that crushed its chest. Just when I thought it was about to use the cube's power again, to regenerate endlessly, I suddenly felt an intensely deadly chill from behind me. From the empty space behind me, hundreds of chains suddenly shot out without warning. These chains were made entirely of 9-colored light and carried an irresistible sealing law that instantly wrapped my limbs and torso tightly in midair. I struggled with all my strength, only to find that the Origin power inside me had been completely suppressed. That prototype, whose chest I should have shattered, was now grinning strangely. The wound in its chest healed instantly as it walked up to me and looked at me with pity in its eyes. "Did you think I was fighting you? I was only buying time to activate the cube. True omniscience and omnipotence can rewrite the underlying genetic code in your body at will." It reached out and pressed a hand against my forehead. I felt a terrifying stream of data flood into my brain. It was trying to forcibly erase all my memories and emotions as a human over the past 10 years, to reformat me into the same cold killing weapon as them. The struggle in the wasteland, the smile on the old man's face, and Honglian's hopes flashed wildly through my mind. "No, I'll never let disgusting parasites like you get your way. I let out a hysterical roar from the depths of my soul and tried to break through the seal by force. But under the suppression of the cube's supreme cosmic laws, my resistance seemed incredibly weak. Had I only just touched the realm of divinity, only to fall in this twisted place. At that critical moment, the origin core in my chest, which had stayed silent all this time, suddenly erupted with a chaotic gray light completely unconstrained by cosmic laws. That light, with overwhelming force, instantly devoured the streams of data invading my brain. Then that gray power surged back along the 9-colored chains and shot straight toward the cube. That so-called all-knowing, all-powerful cosmic cube actually trembled in fear. The first-generation prototype let go in sheer horror and staggered back, as if it had seen a devil. That is impossible. How could there be a chaotic origin inside you that surpasses higher dimensional laws? I let out a cold sneer. The 9-colored chains around me snapped apart inch by inch under the gray light's corrosion. I told you before, I won't just break Earth's limits. I'll crush the rules of this starry sea under my feet. I regained my freedom. I gathered that gray power of chaotic origin once more. There were no flashy moves, just one simple, brutal punch. That punch ignored the distance of space and slammed straight into the cosmic cube, with a heavy impact that seemed to silence the whole universe. That polyhedron glowing with 9-colored light actually cracked from my punch. The prototype let out a shrill, desperate scream. Its body began to collapse along with the cube. Countless streams of higher dimensional energy poured wildly from the cracks and were greedily devoured by my origin core. The entire Spire-class metal fortress lost the support of its core energy and began to completely fall apart. I paid no attention to that fake old man as he turned to ash and immediately turned and rushed out. This colossal thing was about to explode, with enough force to completely destroy several nearby planets. I had to get back to Jupiter's orbit before it blew up. To protect Old Man and Honglian's starship, I turned into a streak of gray light and shot through the collapsing metal maze at full speed. Just 1 second before the fortress exploded completely, I burst through its thick outer armor. Behind me, there blazed a terrifying light brighter than 10,000 suns. The massive shockwave and gamma ray burst from the flare explosion, swept through all of space. I didn't hesitate for a second. I turned around at once and used my divine body to stand between Earth and the shockwave. I spread my arms, and the gray chaos shield instantly expanded to hundreds of thousands of kilometers across. All that deadly energy, enough to destroy Earth's ecosystem, was stopped beyond geostationary orbit. I was like an immovable wall of size, giving everything I had to protect the homeworld where I grew up. When the last of the explosion's aftershocks finally faded, a field of metal wreckage had appeared in Earth's orbit. I let out a long breath, feeling that the power inside me had become even more precise after this crisis. I activated spatial traversal again and returned to the rebel starship hidden near Jupiter's orbit. When Dad saw that I was back safe and sound, he rushed over and pulled me into a bear hug. Honglian stared at the fortress on the holographic screen, now completely destroyed, her eyes full of shock and awe. You didn't just destroy the judgment fortress of the higher dimensional civilization. You also protected Earth. You're a miracle. I shook my head and said, the higher dimensional civilization's true strength definitely goes far beyond this. We need to be ready. Sure enough, the moment I finished saying that, the starship's communications channel was suddenly forced open.